Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dylan Mangel with Nebraska Extension, and today I'm here with Tamra Jackson-Ziems, our Nebraska Extension corn pathologist. And I thought we'd just take this opportunity to have a nice little talk about southern rust in Nebraska. It was a big year for it. So Tamra, what has the history of southern rust in our state been like, and how did we get here this year?
I think that's really important to consider. Thank you for asking. So this year I've been here for 20 years. And in 19 of those 20 years, we have confirmed southern rust somewhere in Nebraska. So having southern rust isn't necessarily unusual. What is unusual is how severely we've had it in 2025 and in 2024 in parts of the state. And I think that's important to talk about because it's not always statewide. It's usually in portions of the state where it's worse.
So 24, 25, is there any other years in recent memory where it's been bad?
There's a few examples, and some people know that because it was bad in their area. The one that sticks out to me right after I started was in 2006. And that's the banner year a lot of people in south central Nebraska think about, where we had just begun to use fungicides. We saw a huge amount of southern rust down there. We also saw some subsequent lodging. Harvest was a mess. And so then a couple years in between, I think 2014 for a lot of people comes to memory too. Okay,
but it's kind of been regional. So is there any correlation between having disease one year and then maybe having it a following year? Given we've just had two relatively bad years in a row, is that just by chance, or is there any correlation to that?
I think that's the golden question right now, and I think that's the fodder for my Mythbusters article in Crop Watch. And so there's a lot of rumors out there as people try to explain why we saw so much disease here this year. And so having seen that 2 years in a row, rust diseases in particular, they have no way to overwinter here. With such specific and narrow host ranges, they have to have living corn plants to live on. And so in Nebraska, we won't ever have southern rust overwinter here. It won't overwinter in Kansas either. We're talking much further south of us. So overwintering is not the reason. We had other situations that created a favorable condition.
So that's a great point. So you need those living corn plants for it to stay on. So there's no alternate host that it can move to that might be around over winter here, right?
Not here, no.
Okay. How does it get here then once we get it? It usually shows up. When does it usually show up and how does it get here?
We've seen southern rust and documented it in July, often in August. Some people say they had it in June. I think we want to be careful. Sometimes it's common rust and they are hard to tell apart. And so southern rust has to blow up here every single year. And not just southern, common rust does as well. The wheat diseases, the rust of wheat, they have to blow up here. And so that comes from some of the southern states. But before that, it was probably in parts of Mexico. And so if people consider that subtropical environment in parts of Mexico, they can actually grow corn year-round. And so, in fact, in parts of Mexico, they're planting and harvesting at the same times. And so there's a constant amount of corn. It provides the inoculum for us, and then when we have southerly winds, it moves it in our direction. This year, it just so happened when we had that southern rust show up, we had the most favorable conditions that we may have ever had for disease development.
Yeah, so it lined it up, it got here, it was ready. And I think you've looked into weather patterns that associated with those. So 24 and 25, we had periods of wind blowing from the south up north, right?
We did, and I don't know that it was extremely from the south. Those winds may not have been historic in a way, but in 2024, keep in mind, we also had a hurricane event just south of us that we believe Hurricane Beryl, and it brought up inoculum, brought up some insects and a few other things that we've talked a lot about. It probably pushed some of those rust fungi closer to us. And unfortunately, parts of Nebraska had a very late planting, like in the northeast part of the state. A lot of that corn was still not tasseling by the time rust arrived. And so the potential for yield loss on plants that became heavily infected was much higher in that part of the state. So it was a much bigger problem this year to have it back to back, and I think it's really causing a lot of alarm. It did not overwinter here, though. We've just had 2 back-to-back years that were exceptional.
Just by chance it happens sometimes. So you mentioned weather. What's going to impact the severity of yield loss once it gets here?
The fungus that causes southern rust, like most fungi, is dependent on weather conditions, and specifically that fungus prefers temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And it doesn't matter if that's nighttime conditions or daytime conditions. This year we were much milder in most of Nebraska, and our temperatures often hovered around 80 degrees. On top of that, high humidity or a lot of moisture from rainfall created a very favorable environment in the corn canopy. So once the spores were here, and we didn't have a whole lot of wind during the season during that time. It wasn't moving it around necessarily. We just had a lot of it just cooking inside there. And of course we may have watered some too, and we're always exacerbating diseases when we're irrigating.
Okay, and does the wind impact like drying down those canopies?
Exactly, and so we do benefit from some of that wind. As annoying as it is sometimes, it does help dry out the canopies. And in extreme eastern Nebraska, we had some record high durations for high humidity and some really favorable weather conditions in the southeast corner and the easternmost counties over into Iowa as well. And so we've all suffered from southern rust in those areas.
Okay, wow. Well, while we're on this topic, before we get too far away, but let's jump over here. You showed me some resources. You talked about tracking it. So why is it important to track where this disease is at?
Well, since it does move up here from the southern states, this gives us a great opportunity to monitor and even have some warning before it ever arrives so that we can begin scouting earlier. And so we do have a map, a monitoring map, where we light up counties, and that's available publicly all the time on the Crop Protection Network. This map is for southern rust that you're looking at now, and so you see the counties highlighted in red. Now we're at the end of the season, so this is the cumulative counties that have been lit up all summer long. And so earlier in the season, you might have noticed a county here and there. We watch in the south and we look to see how much rust is there, but you need to be mindful that not all states are lighting up counties when they find the disease. There's no benefit to them to light up counties. The benefit is for us. And so these maps are important to us, and we depend on samples coming into the diagnostic clinic and communication from stakeholders and from our other extension professionals to make sure that we let people know what's out there.
So it's really, I guess, important. You'll probably see this move north in waves. I mean, sometimes, I worked in the wheat world before, and we'd see events where a lot of rust spores got picked up and pushed really far north. That can happen, and you can have spores fall out over large areas. But I assume historically you've seen it happen down here first. You see it in Arkansas, you see it in Oklahoma. I mean, it's in Texas, but they're not really watching for it, right? They know they've got it.
That's right.
So at what point here do you start to think, okay, we need to get ready? Is it when you see it in Kansas, or?
In Kansas, for sure. In fact, usually when I see counties in Kansas lit up, and we appreciate that they're doing that, I assume it might already be here. And so we start looking.
Okay.
Often when I see it start to show up even in Arkansas in that area, because they're watching closely too, that's another indicator that, we better keep our eyes open and watch for this and start talking about it.
And this is neat. You can see down here in Arkansas, it was late June or so when they started seeing it, and we started verifying it. Early July, mid-July?
Mid-July. And sometimes when we see it in mid-July, depending on the conditions, it may or may not be a problem. This year, of course, it was.
Yep. Wow, fascinating. Okay. One thing I'm curious about is varietal differences. Does variety make a big difference with southern rust?
Well, historically we always said, nah, probably not, because most of our northern germplasm has not been bred or selected against southern rust. But this year I was pleasantly surprised, and you only see this under severe pressure, that we did see differences among those hybrids. And southern rust is generally more of a consistent disease and yield limiting problem in the southern states. Now we've seen it up here, how many? 3 years out of the last 20, maybe more, depending on where you're at. But it looks like we do have some hybrids with better tolerance to it, so that's exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. I suppose if it becomes a more regular problem, if it moves up here more often, I suppose we'll get more data on varieties and see. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but
I hope not, but this gave people an opportunity to collect some really good data on our hybrid differences.
You mentioned common versus southern rust. I struggle to tell them apart, right? Is this something that you can tell in the field if they're...
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Historically we've talked about the color differences. We all know now that southern rust, everybody's seen it. It's orange to tan. It's usually mostly on the upper leaf surface. Well, except when it's not, right? And so sometimes on the underside near the midrib, you'll see some more rust pustules. Common rust can be on the upper and the lower leaf surface, and it tends to be more reddish brown or cinnamony brown.
Okay.
Pustules tend to be a little bigger. The color difference, I wouldn't rely on it though, because it seems to vary. It may be hybrid differences, or it may be related to timing of infection. Whatever it is, really the only way to be certain, let's get samples into the clinic. We can tell instantly under a microscope which one is which.
So it's pretty simple once you have a scope to get it out there and tell them apart.
That's right.
Okay, so the big question now is just, if a grower, they don't know if it's going to be here next year. It's been 2 years, they might be thinking about it. Should growers think about that when they're selecting varieties? And do the seed catalogs even list resistance or tolerance of southern rust in there?
That probably depends on some of the seed companies, and maybe they have more data available to them. And so I definitely work with my seed company advisors and agronomists. If I was in an area where we more consistently see southern rust, which to me, that's in the southernmost counties in Nebraska.
Okay.
And so southeast, south central, maybe more than the rest of the state. And so maybe those are areas where I could do that. Not because I'm worried about it overwintering, but those are the areas where it may not make it to the northern part, but often it'll stay down there. So that would be something I would consider. Okay,
so there's been trends, and I'll show another resource real quick. We have those maps that I showed, but if you go on there as well, you can look at the previous year's end maps. So here's 2024 where it ended, and remember both of those were rough years. Let's look back at 23 and 22 and see how those ended. So 23, not much was going on.
There was a little bit out there, but not a tremendous amount. And 22. Likewise, 22.
Yeah,
similar.
Like you said, it's those southern counties. It just takes time for it to move up, and sometimes it doesn't happen.
It does, and so this is a good wake-up call, too. A lot of people in other parts of the state may not be watching for it and may not know it's there until they hear some of the alerts. We don't want people to have surprises.
Let's jump into management as a whole. So we talk, varietal selection is always a big one. Maybe not as important with southern rust because the data's not there. But how about fungicide application and timing?
That's the critical question, isn't it? So the good news is we have very effective fungicides commercially available right now for southern rust, and we've had them for years. The question is really about timing, and some products do work better than others. The good news for all of our stakeholders, all of our producers, is that we do have a bank of data, not just from the Corn Belt and the Midwest, but we have data that's nationally available and is shared on the Crop Protection Network. And so we share the efficacy data in the fungicide efficacy publication for corn diseases. And so on the screen right now, you can see where that publication is. It's updated annually with new data. And so as you scroll down through there, you're going to see along the top of that table, you've got the most common fungal diseases that we might use fungicides to control listed there. And below that in the column you'll see the ratings for how well we would expect the fungicide products listed on the left to perform against that disease. And so you'll see a lot of them very good, fair, excellent, and there is some variability there. And so hopefully people will use this as a resource when making those selections. And we have gotten questions as people look through here. You're going to notice a lot of these products are some of the newer products that are commercially available from our major manufacturers. We do have generics available too that contain some of the same active ingredients, and that's why those are listed out on that left side of the table, and also color coordinated with the fungicide classes that they belong to. I would expect products that maybe have the same active ingredients to behave similarly.
Okay.
And so that gives you a lot more options out there.
It's good to see this. There's a lot of very good rated products available for that. So maybe the challenge isn't choosing the product. The challenge might be in timing. Obviously, the timing depends on when this shows up.
That's right.
If it shows up right before harvest, at some point you don't need to worry about it because it's not going to do a bunch of damage.
And it often happens that way too.
So, you know, when has it showed up the last couple years, and how should, I mean, if you hear about it, if a grower hears about it, should they rush out and spray, or how do they time that?
And that's the other $1 million question, right? If you hear southern rust is not here, we're not seeing disease activity, and like you said, it shows up at the end of the season, we're not worried. I'm more concerned about protecting those critical grain fill stages, anywhere from pollination up through, say, the dough stage. And so we often, we want to look at, and everybody wants a prescription, when should I spray? I would rather have disease near me or know it's nearby and know that I can spray. And those most common timings are going to be at tassel emergence and after. We don't usually see much disease pressure prior to that. Often, though, we may not have disease pressure until well later. And so an application made early might wear off. Say, if you applied at VT or before, it might wear off before you need the protection that may, you know, when disease is more important down around R2 or R3 at blister and milk.
Yep.
And so with that said, for the people that are applying fungicides routinely at VT, that's usually enough to protect you, except for when you have a severe year like we've had here in 25. Sometimes you might need a second application. If you don't feel like you can afford that, then you especially have to be more diligent about monitoring for disease in your fields.
Yep. So I like this tool. I like this table that they've really kind of summarized exactly what you just said. When you may and may not need a second, when you don't need to worry about it at all, or when it's not likely. So, one quick question. When it comes to variety selection, you can't pick a variety that's good for everything. So if we limited it to just disease, if growers were trying to focus on which one of those columns they should pay attention to, what do you recommend for what to pay attention to if you had to choose one thing?
We've spent all of our time so far talking about southern rust, which you hear me saying it's not going to be this bad every year, I promise, and it hasn't been. So there are diseases and pathogens that overwinter year after year, and so I don't want people to forget about other things like tar spot. So depending on where you are in the state, it really should influence how you make some of these decisions. And so right now, the eastern third of the state, we have more tar spot pressure because that fungus is making its way from the east to the western part of the state. It's made its way about halfway across. You know, we're west to about Dawson County, up through Brown County. Out on those western fringes, usually not bad yet, but at least we want people to be aware this is something to start watching for. Just east of there, though, it's starting to build up because it takes a few years before we have enough of that fungus, or what we call inoculum, built up to where we might see more severe disease, especially in situations like under pivot irrigation, which is very favorable for tar spot development. The other thing to consider, though, is that the conditions favoring tar spot, at least the temperatures, is very different from what is favoring southern rust. And so while southern rust, the perfect temperature is about 80, and you know that range around that, plus or minus 10 degrees maybe, I don't know. Looking at tar spot, it's much less, where the optimal temperature may be between 60 and about 70. Now, that doesn't
Yeah.
mean it's dead when we hit 100 degrees or 90 degrees. It's just slowed down a lot. And so often tar spot may blow up at the end of the season when it's cooler and often more humid.
Okay. So I guess just to conclude, growers need to pay attention to that field history and
Definitely.
choose varieties based off of that, but not for every pathogen. For southern rust, that's not going to overwinter here. Your field history kind of resets every single year. So knowing what's overwintering, the tar spots, the root rots, the things
Yeah.
like that,
Ground rot.
that's what really matters. And it's just the luck of the draw for southern rust every year, right?
It really is, knowing what you have in your fields and knowing which conditions are going to favor it.
Yep. Wow. Okay, so I guess take-homes, southern rust is not overwintering.
I also want to add, we've got a lot of myths going on out there in the countryside. People saying, well, this southern rust is more aggressive. It's reproducing in only 3 days. That is not true. We have not proven that, not seeing research on that. This was just an exceptionally favorable year.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's, diseases are often all over the place, but in many cases, the driver isn't the disease or the pathogen being present, it's the favorable weather. Weather is just a huge role in disease development, for sure. Okay, anything else, Tamra?
I guess I would just like to recommend everyone with questions to reach out to us in Nebraska Extension and check out our resources on Crop Watch from Nebraska Extension and also the Crop Protection Network.
Excellent. And Crop Watch can be found at cropwatch.unl.edu. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.